Hi, and welcome to the Mediatwits number 154. I'm Mark Glaser, Executive Editor of PBS MediaShift. Today we'll be talking about podcasts. This is their moment once again. It's a second kind of round of podcast boom, but are they sustainable, all the new podcasts that are being launched at places like BuzzFeed and the Associated Press? We'll talk about the business behind podcasts and just how big they'll get among Americans and around the world. But first, word from our sponsor. Running your own business requires focus. So does parenting. Mediatwits podcast sponsor, NextSpace, created a place where parents could give their best quality of attention to both co-working space and childcare space under one roof. Learn more at nextspace.us/nextkids. And indeed, I am in NextSpace, the orange color, as you can see behind me. My son, Everett, is in the Next Kids program, so it's pretty awesome here. So before we get into our discussion, I want to introduce our esteemed panel. We have Aaron Burcell joining us from Vevo, formerly at PodShow, Andrew Lih at American University, Andy Bowers at Slate and Panoply Network, Jenna Weiss-Berman from BuzzFeed, and Jefferson Yen, our producer in LA. Andy, you've seen how things have gone in podcasts, through the ups and the downs, and Slate has really stuck with it. While other people kind of had their podcasts, dropped them, and now are bringing them back, Slate's really stuck to it. Tell us about why have podcasts worked so well at Slate, and tell us about this Panoply network and just why you're kind of reaching out to work with other people outside of Slate.
Sure. Well, yeah, they've worked out very well for us. We started about 10 years ago. We actually had a joint venture with NPR, which is where I came from. I joined Slate to work on a joint project with NPR. So we built out studios in both New York, where I am now, and D.C., radio studios. They were fully equipped. So we had everything we needed when podcasting came along, and we had a radio veteran, me, on staff. So we just started trying to figure out who were the most interesting people at Slate, what topics they could talk about, and see what it would work, how well it would work. It turns out it worked really well because it's an opinion magazine, so people aren't shy about getting into arguments, standing their ground. The audience seemed to really enjoy it. And especially, I think the reason we're still doing it today is that the hosts really like doing it. In fact, they've gotten so into it that everyone at Slate now wants a podcast. They push me against the wall and say, "When am I getting a podcast?" And
what do you tell them?
Sorry?
What do you tell them?
I say they're in the queue. We're working on it. We're trying to roll out new things in a smart way and a sustainable way, but it seems to be going well, and it's popular. And in fact, the hosts of our flagship show, the Political Gabfest, David Plotz and Emily Bazelon, have both left Slate in the last year. But the one thing they wanted to keep doing was their show, and I couldn't get the microphones out of their cold, dead hands if I wanted to. They love it. The audience engagement is so much fun. They do live shows. So it's been great for the Slate brand. It's brought in a lot of new people who didn't even know about the magazine who are now passionate about it. So we decided with Panoply to extend this to other, primarily media brands, print magazines, newspapers. We're working now with the New York Times magazine, with New York Magazine, Inc., Real Simple, a couple of authors. We wanted to help them get into this space, and we wanted to bring all of these together into one network that, frankly, from the business point of view, would be easier and larger to sell to advertisers.
So this is kind of the typical network model, roll up a lot of different properties and then you can kind of sell across them. I mean, does that work as much in podcasts? Because podcasts do seem like a very personal, like you said, that's very much about the hosts and people kind of voicing their own ads and everything. How do you scale it that way?
You're right, and that's especially true with what has been the dominant advertising model in podcasting so far, which is direct response advertisers, like the sponsor you just told us about, where they're sort of bespoke ads for each individual podcast, each individual host. Those are harder to scale. What we're hoping to get more into, and something that Slate has done over the years and has expertise in, is more brand advertising. So, messages that are not specific call-outs to do things, but trying to get the brand name out there. Those are a little easier, we hope, to sell across a network so that not each one has to be tailored so individually. We'll see if our experiment works.
Yeah, and Andrew, you're kind of the big Slate podcast fanboy on our show, and you brought it up many times in the past. What is it about you as a listener and someone who's obviously a media nerd, I guess we could say, a media twit? What is it about Slate's podcast that draws you to them? I mean, why theirs?
Yeah, I think Slate's quite interesting because it'd be interesting to hear from Andy whether people know about Slate as podcasts first and publication second. Has it flipped at all? Because a lot of the exposure I think folks have now to Slate come from the podcast side. And one of the things that I thought was interesting from Slate's perspective was the ability to scale up its GabFest model, right, which is basically a roundtable of journalists who are talking about either sports or pop culture or politics. And just the mix of folks is always tough to get right, and I think you've hit on a formula that really worked well. And if you look at the two types of podcasts, I think have really taken off recently. If people remember this old site called Television Without Pity, for pop culture, when Dawson's Creek and all these other shows were on, there'd be a very snarky write-up maybe a day or so later after those shows aired, and now you're seeing that podcasts have taken up that role to the point where you have folks like AfterBuzz that actually record minutes after the show airs to have the first kind of roundtable around The Walking Dead or The Bachelor right away. And Slate's model as well, which is locking up exclusives. So, one of the things I enjoy on Slate is the Americans podcast, where it's not just talking about the show, but because there's a special connection with the Weisberg brothers, Slate's got an inside track on the producers, the actors, the production designers, and you get a real cool inside look at a show, and it's almost like attending film school within a podcast. So I'd be interested to hear from Andy, is Slate's identity shifting somewhat because the podcasts are becoming so popular now?
Well, thank you for that, Andrew. Yes and no. Obviously, a site the size of Slate has many, many more viewers and readers than it does podcast listeners. I think that's always going to be the case. But a lot of our podcast listeners come from elsewhere. They come through iTunes. They come through the other channels through which people discover podcasts, and many of those people have either never heard of Slate before or never really tried it. So we feel like there's a lot of cross-fertilization going on there. As you talk about the TV recaps and things like that, yes, we've been doing that in a number of fields for a long time. We do it with movies for about 10 years now. We do it with books. We have a book club where we suggest to people that they read a book with us over the month and then come and listen to a discussion. And one reason I think that format works really well for AfterBuzz and for us and for all the other people doing it is that you want to talk about a TV show when it's over, especially a really intense one like The Americans. You just want to talk about it with someone, and you can read about it, and there are excellent recaps in print, but I think the visceral feel of how other people reacted, and they're excited about it, and they just want to say, oh my God, did you see that thing, that scene, that amazing scene? It's more how you talk about a TV show when you're done, and the American one in particular, you're right, there is a connection between the Slate Group chairman, Jacob Weisberg, and the creator of The Americans, Joe Weisberg, which is how I got an in. But I thought of doing that after hearing a similar thing from Breaking Bad and Vince Gilligan. They did a podcast that I think a lot of people didn't know about when that show was on. I discovered it in the last season and thought, this is fantastic. I want to do this with another show I love. This one seemed perfect, and you're right. It is kind of like a master class in how to produce a season of television.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you think that now, as popular as these recaps are, maybe the shows themselves and the producers will just start doing their own podcast because just to kind of capitalize on the success and the fan base that they have. Jenna, I'm curious, you're kind of taking a different take at BuzzFeed. You just launched your first 2 podcasts. Tell us about the thinking behind, why to go into podcasts. BuzzFeed, we know, has been incredible at spreading kind of viral stories, listicles, all the things it does now, even investigative reporting. Why podcasts, and what's kind of the thinking behind the launches?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people thought that we were getting into this because, people are calling this the golden age of podcasting, the golden age of audio. But I think that what BuzzFeed tries to do is connect with audiences through like every way we possibly can. So, all different apps, and we're all over Instagram and Snapchat, and I think audio is just yet another way we can connect to an audience. And right now it's a bare bones operation. There are only two of us, so I think that there's been kind of an impression that because we're BuzzFeed, we're like this massive team. But the way that BuzzFeed starts everything is very small, and so we launched with 2 talk shows less than 2 weeks ago, and it's kind of Gabfesty style. Andy is definitely the godfather of podcasting, so we took we got a lot of inspiration from the Slate podcasts. So right now we have a couple of talk shows, and I'm excited about them, and I think that we'll be expanding. I think we want to do a lot more experimenting, possibly, look into a daily news show or a short-run podcast where we do like 5 episodes and then it's over, possibly celebrity-on-celebrity interviews shows, that sort of thing. So we're looking into a lot. We're very new, and we're having a lot of fun so far.
Can I just say one thing to
yes,
Jenna?
please.
First of all, congratulations on joining the podcastosphere. We're excited. You've done a great job so far. And just a little anecdote, there was some article about you joining that said that BuzzFeed was spending $50 million just on podcasts, and hearts stopped in every other podcast network all over America.
I know, and I actually saw that, and I immediately emailed the New York Observer and said, "Can you please correct that, because it's not a fact." BuzzFeed did get a bunch of money last year from investors, and it definitely is not all going to podcasting.
Did you say it's really $50, not $50 million?
Basically, but they did correct that, so yeah, it freaked a lot of people out.
So now I noticed that the ones you launched, they definitely skew younger than I'd say the kind of the Slate podcasts do. And we all think and just assume you have the formula for making everything go viral. What are the challenges to make audio go viral versus video, GIFs, everything else that you guys do?
Yeah, the challenges of making audio go viral are definitely it's a very real problem, and I don't know that I've seen it happen quite yet. I think a lot of it is about the length, and honestly, when I started at BuzzFeed, I was pretty clear that I realized that this is a place that makes a lot of things go viral, but that my goal here is to make just really high quality content, and so that's what I'm more concerned with than kind of making things go viral. We do have a great kind of immediate audience because we can put these things out as BuzzFeed posts and get a bunch of people listening, but yeah, I don't think right now I'm too concerned with audio going viral, but it's something that we think about, of course, and that I'm sure we all think about.
Right. How do you measure success if you're not worried about viral? You are worried. You would like to just have audience and solid, loyal audience, I assume.
Definitely, and we're definitely looking at numbers. I really wanted to put shows out there that kind of filled a hole in podcasting. There are not many. One of our shows is hosted by 2 young black women, and that's definitely pretty rare in podcasting. It is kind of a white male-dominated medium. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but we wanted to try something new. And then we have another one about kind of weird communities on the internet that I think we're gearing towards younger audiences. I definitely want to bring in younger people. We did this survey with some of our interns here, and we asked them, like, what's life going to be like in your 30s? And one of them said, well, when you're in your 30s, like your late 30s, you listen to podcasts. And another one was like, what are podcasts? So I was like, we have to make these more accessible to younger people. So I think that's definitely what we're going to be trying to do.
Yeah. And Aaron, I want to bring you into the conversation. You were at kind of I think what was the first podcast network, what was called PodShow, eventually Mevio. with Adam Curry, I guess the first Podfather before Andy Bowers. Tell us about the lessons that you guys learned at PodShow and maybe how applicable they are today.
Well, I think in terms of lessons, we learned that monetization was a little further ahead of the medium. And when I say that, I mean there was a lot of people eager to sponsor podcasts and start to figure out how to invest in podcasting, both from a brand marketer standpoint and from a what you call a call to action or a CPA type of marketing. The medium itself was still developing in 2006, 2007, and I think it was, the money and the effort was a little bit ahead of the technology. I think if you remember that time, podcasting was a mobile device that was tethered to a PC, so people had to download this media and then sync it to a different machine, and Wi-Fi wasn't ever present, as opposed to today where I'm a busy guy, didn't have time for Serial when it first came out, grabbed all the episodes, got on a plane. Actually, I got on the plane and from the plane's Wi-Fi grabbed all the episodes and listened to them on a long flight. And that's a completely, that's a technological leap compared to 2006, 2007 when, podcasting was still full of hurdles for the end user. But I think, even then, PodShow made a lot of money. Made a lot of money its first year, made a lot of money its second year, did very well in rounding up and creating a market, really. And a lot of credit goes to Chris Jacob, who did that early on at PodShow, who really went out, he went to Charlotte Street, he went to Madison Avenue, and he made sure everybody understood the opportunity. And Adam Curry was right there along with it, using his persona, using his presence to really convince people that this was a real and viable medium. And there were other players involved as well. Dave Weiner he's still an evangelist, but these people were building a market. And even though it happened, it sort of popped in 2006, 2007, 2008. I agree with the New York Times assessment that it sort of dissipated for a few years. It went away, and I'm really pleased to see a resurgence.
Yeah. Andy, I mean, have you seen that as well? I mean, as far as this is about a technological leap, I mean, things like Apple CarPlay, I mean, the fact that you'll be able to get in your car and just pull up the podcast you want, maybe even by voice or speech. I mean, is this a lot about technology, this kind of latest boom?
Yes, very much so. And in fact, I contend that the dip in podcasting was much more about the hype than it was about the reality of it. We started in 2005. Our audience has gone up every single year since then on a pretty steady trajectory. So that graph looks a lot different than if you were able to graph the hype, which was huge when it started. Then everyone thought it was a joke. It was a punchline. Everyone turned their attention to YouTube, which came out shortly after podcasting was big. And now we're in another so-called renaissance. But I think really the growth of podcasting has been tied much more to technology. Every time it gets a little bit easier for people to jump over that hurdle, more people get in. And my contention is that almost no one who gets into podcasting then leaves. It's like when you first got a DVR and you were able to time shift the shows that you used to have to wait until they were actually on the air. Who wants to go back to that? Podcasting is a very sticky medium, and the research, both external and some surveys we've done at Slate, show that once they get into it, they not only keep listening, but they listen to more and more, 7, 8 podcasts a week. It's sticky, and it's here to stay.
Yeah, and Andrew, you're nodding your head because you're obviously stuck, and you're not going to ever stop listening to podcasts. But we also talked a little bit about kind of younger generation, and can this become something that's more a part of what they do? I mean, what have you seen as far as the challenges of getting to a younger audience?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I think part of it also is, podcasts fit the lifestyle of folks that are getting on a little bit, and they drive to places, they've got kids, they're getting to walk the dog. At least that's my case. So I found that about 50% of my content I get pretty much from podcasts, whether it's NPR or Slate or tech podcasts or education podcasts. And it's just a necessity in some ways because I'm moving so much and I don't really have the time to sit down and absorb a lot of things. But as Andy said also, it's nice that if you know what you're doing and you have a good podcast client, the stickiness is there, right? You hit the refresh button and boom, all the new things that are there for the day or for the week are there for the taking, and that's a really nice way of getting stuff. There is that tyranny of the default, which is, until Apple created a decent default podcast app, it was just a mystery as to how to get a podcast. Different clients, do you use iTunes, do you not use iTunes? But I'm impressed to see that Slate has seen a growth every year despite the changing landscape and different devices and different support, the levels of support for podcasts going forward. But I think as Jenna mentioned, it's going to be interesting to see people play around with the form factor to see if you can get younger folks interested in shorter bursts or different types of content. I've seen different approaches to pop culture analysis shows that are different than what we're used to hearing. So maybe there's some room for innovation there. But even trying to get my journalism students to listen to more podcasts, just kind of, they don't have the time or the bandwidth to absorb audio programming for its own sake. And even when I try to get some of my students in sports journalism to apply to be interns at Slate's Hang Up and Listen sports podcast, it was a big mystery to them.
One thing about adolescents and podcasts, in general, I think you're right, but there have been a few that have really hit home with adolescents, including Welcome to Night Vale, which probably most of you know. It's kind of a scripted drama, but I went to a conference where those guys were speaking, and they said, most of our audience is teenage girls. And I thought, really? And I walked outside the conference room, and there were all these teenage girls sitting there on their phones saying, have you heard episode 5 yet? Oh, my God. So that one has crossed over, and I actually think Serial did, too. At least in my household, my 15-year-old daughter and all her friends were on the phone with each other every night after the new episodes dropped talking about it. They were riveted by Serial. So I think there's a lot of potential there if the programming is right.
Yeah, Jenna, what are you thinking when it comes to, lengths and other ways of promoting? How do you think you will reach kind of a more diverse audience?
Yeah, so and it's interesting to talk about technology because I think a lot of that will be technology, and there are a couple of interesting new tools that I've been sort of looking into. There's this thing called Acast from Sweden, which it's very popular there, and they're kind of trying to break into the American market right now. And part of what that is, it's an app that aggregates audio, and it also can make it a visual experience. So we could put out like a 3-minute podcast, and we could have corresponding photos that are part of that. So if you take out your phone, you can kind of be seeing what is happening, what you're listening to. So I think that technology will certainly have a lot to do with who becomes more interested in this. If you're a teen, there's definitely like fast visual media is very popular with younger people, and so if we can figure out interesting ways to incorporate kind of multimedia into audio, I think that's going to be a big part of it. And just to speak a little bit to Serial and Night Vale, those are interesting shows in that I think a lot of people think of podcasting as a very kind of solitary thing. You kind of have this intimate relationship with the hosts, and it's you're listening in just your own 2 ears. And Serial and Night Vale are more kind of social listening, and that is also I think part of what made them popular with younger people is that it became this like very kind of social and social media experience. So to have something that is like serialized and ongoing and something that people are talking about is definitely, I think that those things will inevitably bring in large audiences and definitely younger audiences as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of the cultural thing about social listening because, you think about that happening when people sat around their radios in, the 30s and 40s as a family. And when I started listening to Serial, I wanted to listen to it with my wife, and it was so weird. We couldn't really figure out exactly how to do that together. Do we like lay in bed and listen to this, or how does it work? I mean, has anyone had that kind of awkward experience of like, how do you experience a podcast in a group setting, really?
In my household, my wife and I are often listening to different podcasts on our headphones and often bump into each other in the hall. Oh, sorry, what are you listening to?
Right, but how do you listen to things together? I mean, it's just a different experience that we're just not used to. It's not really programmed into us, I guess. Well, thanks a lot. I really appreciate the discussion. I want to thank our guests, Aaron Burcell from Vevo, Andrew Lih, American University, Andy Bowers at Slate and Panoply, Jenna Weiss-Berman from BuzzFeed, our producer Jefferson Yen, and our sponsor NextSpace and NextKids. You can learn more about them at nextspace.us/nextkids. We'll catch you every Friday on the Mediatwits at PBS MediaShift at pbs.org/MediaShift. Thanks, everyone, and have a great weekend.